already engaged 2 Iranian missiles and 3 Iranian UAVs launched today, the day after the overnight exchange. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi, responding to all of it, said every time a diplomatic solution is on the table, the U.S. opts for a reckless military adventure. And an unnamed American administration official told a Fox News reporter last night that this is not a restarting of the war and is not an end to the ceasefire. That is the official position. That is what the American government is saying about a situation in which both sides fired weapons at each other. 3 U.S. destroyers transited the strait under active attack. Strikes were carried out against Iranian targets inside Iranian territory at Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Kargon, and Iran launched coordinated multi-layer attacks against American warships and Gulf partner infrastructure on the same day. Not a restarting of the war. Not an end to the ceasefire. It is the Russia Special Military Operation formulation applied to the Strait of Hormuz. When the two sides are shooting at each other with missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and precision munitions into vessel smokestacks, you are not in a ceasefire. You are in a war that has not been formally named because formally naming it would require political consequences that neither side is prepared to accept at this specific moment. But the Strait of Hormuz is not keeping track of the formal designation. The fires still burning on satellite imagery of the strait this morning are not keeping track of the formal designation. The sailors transferred to Iranian hospitals after their vessel caught fire near Minab are not keeping track of the formal designation. And the 3 destroyers that crossed the strait under active fire with no damage to any American asset are communicating something about the formal designation that no administration official's statement can modify. The ceasefire is over in everything except the name. And the name is the only thing keeping anybody from acting like it. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand what happened overnight and why the sequence of events that produced last night's exchange tells you more about where this conflict is heading than any diplomatic statement from any capital involved in the negotiations, you need to understand what Project Freedom started, why Iran was always going to respond to it with exactly the kind of multi-layer attack it launched, and why the most analytically revealing statement about this conflict in the past week came not from a government official or a military commander, but from a former National Security Council official writing in a magazine about why both sides believe they have won a war that is still very much being fought. Here's where we stand as of today. The USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, transited the international sea passage of the Strait of Hormuz overnight under coordinated Iranian attack. Iranian forces launched multiple missiles, drones, and small boats against those destroyers simultaneously. U.S. Central Command confirmed that no U.S. assets were struck. U.S. forces eliminated all inbound threats and, critically, did not limit their response to defending against the attacking assets. They went after the sources: missile and drone launch sites inside Iranian territory, command and control locations, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes. That means the overnight exchange was not a defensive engagement in which American ships repelled an Iranian attack and then returned to their transit posture. It was a reciprocal strike operation in which American forces used the Iranian attack as the authorization trigger for hitting targets inside Iran that had been generating the attack capability. A significant difference. One is self-defense during a transit. The other is the resumption of offensive military operations against Iranian military infrastructure using an Iranian attack as the legal and political authorization. And an administration official is telling a Fox News reporter this morning that it is not a restarting of the war, which is technically accurate in the sense that no one has formally declared the war restarted, and completely irrelevant to the people who were in the drone and missile launch sites that were struck last night inside Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Kargon. Now let me give you Trump's statement from last night in its complete text, because the specific language he chose tells you everything about where the administration's threshold for declared resumption of hostilities currently sits. Quote, 3 first-class American destroyers have now, with great success, crossed the Strait of Hormuz under fire. No damage was caused to the 3 destroyers, but very heavy damage was inflicted on the Iranian attackers. And just as we knocked them out today, we will knock them out a lot harder and a lot more violent in the future if they don't get a deal signed fast. Read those 2 sentences with the attention they deserve. The first establishes the operational result. 3 destroyers through, no damage to American assets. Very heavy damage to Iranian forces. The second establishes the escalation framework. What was done last night will be done harder and more violently in the future if a deal is not signed fast. That is not deterrence language. That is sequencing language. It describes yesterday's military action as the first increment in a progression that has additional increments already planned and ready to execute. And it puts a timeline on the deal window that is defined not by a specific number of days, but by the rate at which Iran's behavior provokes the next increment. Every attack Iran launches on American assets, every missile fired at UAE infrastructure, every drone sent against Gulf partner facilities shortens the distance between the current operational tempo and the harder and more violent response Trump described. The deal window is open. The harder response is waiting for Iran to either close the window from the deal side or collapse it from the escalation side. Now let me give you the Iranian account of what happened last night, because the gap between the Iranian narrative and the documented operational reality is the most revealing indicator of the IRGC's current informational and strategic position. The IRGC Navy Command said, and I want you to hear this specific language carefully because it tells you exactly who the audience is for this communication. Quote, following the violation of the ceasefire and the aggression of the terrorist U.S. military against an Iranian oil tanker, and as destroyers of the terrorist U.S. military approached the Strait of Hormuz, a very large-scale and precise combined operation was carried out. IRGC naval forces opened fire on the enemy destroyers using various types of anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as destructive drones equipped with high-explosive warheads. Intelligence monitoring indicates considerable damage to the American enemy, and 3 invading enemy warships quickly fled the Strait of Hormuz area. Read the last phrase. 3 invading enemy warships quickly fled the Strait of Hormuz area. The 3 destroyers that the IRGC claims fled the strait are the same 3 destroyers that U.S. Central Command confirmed transited the international sea passage. They are the same 3 destroyers that Trump described as having crossed with great success with no damage to any American asset. They are the same 3 destroyers that are, as of this morning, on the other side of the strait, having completed their transit. You cannot flee through a choke point and complete your transit simultaneously. The narrative and the operational reality are not reconcilable. And the Iranian state media outlet Mehr News, in the closest thing to a battle damage assessment available from the Iranian side, reported not on damaged American destroyers, but on an Iranian cargo vessel near Minab that was struck and caught fire, with 10 injured Iranian sailors transferred to a hospital and 5 more whose fate was being determined by local search teams. That is the Iranian account of the battle damage from last night. 10 Iranian sailors injured, 5 missing, an Iranian vessel on fire, not 3 damaged American destroyers. Not considerable damage to the American enemy, an Iranian cargo vessel burning near Minab, and the IRGC publishing footage of what it described as a strike on an American warship with no evidence that the footage depicted what the caption claimed. Now let me give you the vessel disabling operations that preceded the overnight exchange, because the escalation pattern from diplomatic pause to active military engagement did not begin last night. It has been building in visible and documented steps since Trump announced the pause of Project Freedom. On May 6th, a U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornet from the USS Abraham Lincoln disabled the Iranian-flagged MT Hosna as it attempted to sail to an Iranian port in the Gulf of Oman, firing several rounds from a 20mm cannon into the vessel's rudder. On May 8th, U.S. forces disabled the MT Sea Star 3 and the MT Sevda, both vessels that were approaching Iranian ports in the Gulf of Oman in violation of the ongoing blockade. A U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornet from the USS George H.W. Bush disabled both tankers by firing precision munitions directly into their smokestacks, preventing them from completing their transit to Iran. Read that targeting choice carefully. Not the engine room, not the rudder, the smokestacks. Firing precision munitions into a vessel's exhaust stacks eliminates propulsion by attacking the functional component that connects the engine's output to the vessel's forward motion, without the catastrophic hull damage that would sink the vessel or endanger the crew in ways that make the interdiction operationally and legally complicated. It is a deliberately chosen calibration. The most minimally sufficient application of force to stop a vessel's movement, demonstrating that American pilots can put a munition precisely where they choose, and using that precision as the communication rather than the explosion it produces. 3 vessels disabled. MT Hosna by 20mm cannon into the rudder. MT Sea Star 3 and MT Sevda by precision munitions into the smokestacks. All 3 are no longer transiting to Iran. All 3 represent the escalation ladder between the diplomatic pause and the overnight exchange that Trump described as the template for harder and more violent responses to come. Now let me tell you about the analytical frame that should be applied to everything you read about this conflict for the rest of the time it runs, because it is the most honest assessment of the strategic situation that has appeared in any serious publication since the ceasefire was announced on April 8th. Thomas Wright, who served on the National Security Council under the previous administration, published a piece in The Atlantic in which he made the following observation. Iran and the United States have failed to come to an agreement not because hardliners are blocking pragmatists inside of Iran, but because both sides sincerely believe that they have won the war. Read that sentence slowly. Not because hardliners are blocking pragmatists inside of Iran. That framing, the framing that has been central to most international media coverage of this conflict, that the obstacle to a deal is internal Iranian factional competition between the IRGC hardliners who want to continue the conflict and the civilian diplomatic pragmatists who want to negotiate, is not the primary explanation for why the deal has not materialized. According to Wright's analysis, both sides sincerely believe they have won the war. That reframes everything. If the American side believes it has won the war, the deal it will accept is one that locks in the gains from that victory, specifically the elimination of Iran's nuclear weapons production capability and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz to unimpeded commercial transit. If the Iranian side believes it has won the war, the deal it will accept is one that recognizes Iranian sovereignty over the strait, restores Iranian access to international financial systems, and preserves the nuclear program that was supposed to be the regime's ultimate insurance policy. Those two deals are not compatible. They are not different starting positions in a negotiation that creative diplomacy can bridge. They are incompatible definitions of what victory means, and you cannot negotiate a ceasefire between two parties who each believe they have already won the underlying conflict. Now let me show you why Wright's observation matters for interpreting Iranian behavior specifically, because it provides the explanatory frame that makes the IRGC's actions since the ceasefire was announced coherent rather than irrational. If the IRGC believes it has won the war, or at minimum has a path to victory through the asymmetric capabilities that survived Operation Epic Fury, then every action it has taken since the ceasefire makes strategic sense within that frame. Firing at commercial ships 9 times since the ceasefire, attacking U.S. forces more than 10 times, launching missiles and drones at UAE infrastructure, claiming the destroyers fled the strait last night. All of it is consistent with the behavior of a party that believes it is operating from a position where its continued pressure is more expensive for the other side than the deal being demanded, and that the passage of time is reducing American domestic tolerance for the conflict rather than increasing Iranian pain to the point of capitulation. That belief is not evidence-free. The United States has consumed 45% of its precision strike missiles in 7 weeks. Gas prices are up. European partners are restless. Pakistan is managing a complicated relationship with both sides. And the ceasefire, whatever its current operational reality, exists in name because the American political system has not yet authorized a formal resumption of hostilities. From inside the IRGC's frame, those factors might reasonably look like a war that is becoming too expensive for the American side to sustain indefinitely. The problem with that frame is that it requires ignoring everything the blockade is doing to the Iranian side simultaneously. $500 million per day in lost revenue. Karg Island storage approaching its ceiling. The 6-week countdown to forced well shutdown. China redirecting to Russian supply. The UAE freezing Iranian financial assets. The IRGC's inability to pay its soldiers reliably. All of those factors are also operating simultaneously with the American ammunition consumption and the political pressure on Washington. And the question that Wright's analysis surfaces is which set of facts is the more accurate input to each side's victory calculation. Now let me take you inside the specific operational picture that last night's exchange produced, because the targets CENTCOM struck and the targeting methodology they represent tell you something important about where the American operational posture is positioned between defensive interception and renewed offensive campaign. U.S. Central Command confirmed strikes against missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes. That target list goes well beyond the vessels that were attacking the destroyers in the strait. Missile and drone launch sites that can be located deep inside Iranian territory were struck specifically to reduce the capability to generate future attacks, not just to defeat the attacks that were already inbound. Command and control locations were struck specifically to degrade the organizational infrastructure that coordinates maritime harassment operations, not just to stop the specific coordination effort that produced last night's attack. ISR nodes were struck specifically to reduce Iranian awareness of American naval movements and forced dispositions in the strait. That is a targeting logic that looks more like the beginning of a renewed offensive campaign against Iranian military infrastructure than like the minimum necessary response to defend destroyers in transit. And it sits within the policy framework that Trump described when he said, "We will knock them out a lot harder and a lot more violent if a deal is not signed fast," because the target set that was engaged last night in the triangle of Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Kargon is precisely the triangle of infrastructure that Iran has been using to facilitate its control and restriction of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. was not just defending the destroyers. It was degrading the capability that produces the threat to the destroyers. Those are fundamentally different operational activities, wearing the same immediate justification. Now let me show you what the Magura unmanned surface vessel reference in the IRGC's statement means, because it is the detail that deserves more analytical attention than most coverage has given it. The IRGC Navy Command's statement specifically mentioned destructive drones equipped with high explosive warheads. That language is consistent with unmanned surface vessels, specifically the type of remotely operated explosive-laden boat that Ukraine has deployed against Russian naval assets in the Black Sea with devastating effectiveness. Iran has been developing unmanned surface vessel capability inspired by and in some cases derived from the same conceptual architecture as Ukraine's Magura V5. The Houthis have also been deploying unmanned surface vessels against Red Sea commercial shipping. If the IRGC attempted to deploy unmanned surface vessels against 3 American Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers last night in the Strait of Hormuz, that represents a qualitative escalation in the attack methodology beyond the fast attack boat swarms that Apache and Seahawk helicopters dismantled on May 4th. Unmanned surface vessels present a different threat profile than crewed fast attack boats. They do not require a crew to accept the risk of engaging an Arleigh Burke. They can be deployed at lower cost than a crewed vessel, and they can be operated remotely from positions well outside the American defensive response envelope. Whether the IRGC's unmanned surface vessel capability is sufficiently developed to constitute a genuine operational threat to American destroyers is a question that the American defensive systems in the Strait answered last night by reporting no hits on any American asset. But the fact that the IRGC was attempting to use them, if the attack description is accurate, tells you that the fast attack boat swarm doctrine, whose failure was proven on May 4th, has been supplemented with unmanned alternatives that the doctrine's designers believe might succeed where the crewed swarm failed. That innovation pattern is the most dangerous thing about the current military situation. Not the specific capabilities the IRGC has now. The adaptations it is developing under the cover of the ceasefire that everyone is pretending is still in effect. Now let me address the Gulf partner dimension of last night's events, because Iran's continued attacks on UAE infrastructure are producing a diplomatic and military consequence that is not fully visible in the Strait of Hormuz reporting, but that is reshaping the regional coalition around the American position in ways that Iran appears not to have anticipated. When Project Freedom launched and Iran responded by attacking UAE infrastructure multiple times in consecutive days, and when the initial American characterization of those attacks was that they fell below the threshold of a ceasefire violation, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE were reportedly upset. They were upset because the American characterization effectively licensed Iran to attack their infrastructure as long as the attacks did not directly hit American assets. The Gulf states were absorbing Iranian military action, while the American government was describing that action as insufficiently provocative to warrant a response. That characterization changed last night. The American response to the Iranian attack on the destroyers included strikes against the military infrastructure that had been generating attacks on both American and Gulf partner assets. The signal to the Gulf states is that the American response to Iranian attacks is no longer calibrated exclusively to what hits American assets directly. It includes the infrastructure that enables attacks on the broader coalition. And the UAE's confirmation this morning that it has already engaged 2 Iranian missiles and 3 UAVs demonstrates both that Iran has not stopped attacking Gulf partner infrastructure after the overnight American response, and that the Gulf states are now actively engaging Iranian weapon systems in their airspace rather than absorbing the attacks without military response. The coalition is tightening around the escalation rather than fracturing from it. Now let me bring the 3-track convergence into the complete picture. Financial track. The blockade has disabled 3 Iranian vessels and turned back over 50 since April 13th. The MT Hosna by 20mm cannon into the rudder. The MT Sea Star 3 and the MT Sevda by precision munitions into the smokestacks. None of them are reaching Iranian ports. The blockade has not paused for 1 second, despite the diplomatic pause on Project Freedom escort operations. Karg Island's storage is approaching the physical ceiling that forces well shut down with the geological permanence that cannot be reversed by a diplomatic agreement. The financial clock is running through the overnight exchange exactly as it was running before the exchange. Military track. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz under coordinated Iranian attack without a single American asset being struck. CENTCOM struck missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and ISR nodes inside Iranian territory at Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Kargon in response. FA-18 Super Hornets from both the Abraham Lincoln and the George H.W. Bush disabled Iranian vessels attempting to bypass the blockade. The UAE engaged 2 Iranian missiles and 3 UAVs today. The military track is running and its operational tempo has visibly increased overnight in a way that the ceasefire label is struggling to contain. Political and narrative track. Both sides believe they have won the war according to a former NSC official's analysis. The IRGC is claiming 3 destroyers fled, while satellite imagery shows fires still burning at the locations of Iranian assets that were destroyed. Araghchi is calling American action a reckless military adventure. An American administration official is saying this is not a restarting of the war. And Iran is carrying out additional attacks against the UAE this morning, the morning after the overnight exchange, in the period when ceasefire logic would normally produce at least a pause in hostile activity to allow diplomatic communication to occur. None of those 3 tracks are pointing toward an imminent deal. All 3 are pointing toward the same threshold from different directions. Here's the complete honest strategic assessment. The ceasefire, whatever it was called and whatever political weight the label was supposed to carry, has functionally ended in the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides are shooting at each other. Both sides are describing the other's actions as the violation that justifies their own response. The American side is striking inside Iranian territory while calling it not a restarting of the war. The Iranian side is launching coordinated missile, drone, and boat attacks against American destroyers while calling the destroyer's successful transit a defeat of the enemy. The satellite imagery shows fires still burning from last night's engagements. Iranian sailors are in hospitals. American destroyers completed their transit without damage. And Trump has already told the world that the next response will be harder and more violent. The Thomas Wright analysis is the most honest available framing for why this state of affairs is where the negotiations have produced rather than a deal. Both sides sincerely believe they have won. The side that believes it has won has very little incentive to accept the terms the other side is offering, because the other side's terms are terms for a loser to accept, and each side believes it is not the loser. The American blockade is winning economically. The IRGC's asymmetric harassment is winning the narrative for domestic Iranian consumption. And the distance between those two realities is the distance between a signed deal and a harder and more violent response to the next Iranian attack. The structural risk that demands the most serious attention is not the Magura unmanned surface vessels or the missile launches at the UAE or the coordination between the IRGC's naval and missile forces that produced last night's multi-layer attack. It is the specific combination of the Wright analysis with the decentralized autonomous IRGC regional command structure. If both sides believe they have won and both sides are therefore disinclined to accept the other's deal terms, the conflict continues. And if the conflict continues under a nominal ceasefire label that no longer constrains either side's operational tempo, the next Iranian attack against American assets is authorized not by a central command decision from Vahidi's office, but by an autonomous regional IRGC commander who has his own assessment of what the overnight exchange proved. Last night's exchange proved to the autonomous regional commanders that the American destroyers transited the strait. It proved that the American military will strike inside Iran in response to attacks on those destroyers. And it proved that claiming a victory while satellite imagery shows the fires of destroyed Iranian assets is the communication available to commanders who need to tell their internal audience something other than what the operational scoreboard says. The next autonomous regional commander who decides to launch something bigger, or something that cannot be defended against completely, or something that hits an American asset in a way that no amount of official characterization can describe as a non-escalation, is the single most dangerous variable in the current situation. Not the formal decision to resume the war. The autonomous decision of an individual IRGC commander who is running his own victory calculation in the Strait of Hormuz at 2 a.m. 3 destroyers went through. No American assets were struck. Iranian vessels are burning near Minab and in the satellite imagery of the strait. The FA-18s are still flying off the Abraham Lincoln and the George H.W. Bush and putting precision munitions into smokestacks and cannon rounds into rudders. Bandar Abbas, Qeshm, and Kargon were struck overnight against drone launch sites, command nodes, and ISR infrastructure. The UAE engaged 2 missiles and 3 UAVs this morning. Trump said the next response will be harder and more violent. Iran said 3 destroyers fled. The destroyers completed their transit. An administration official said this is not a restarting of the war. Both sides believe they have won. And somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz, in the command